To start, or do you want me immediately?
Yeah. No, I would love to introduce you. So, hello everybody. Good evening to Inbal. It's 8 o'clock here in Israel. My name is Sarah, and I am thrilled to open up our series this year of bringing Israel to your JCC. We're very excited about this series, as we hope it will be a great opportunity to bring some of the best things coming out of Israel to your JCC, um, for, for you to learn for yourselves, and also hopefully to be inspired and go on and do great things in the programming area, or sharing with your staff or your members some of the things that you will learn and enjoy from these Zooms. Our next Zoom will be at the end of October, and we'll be sending out reminders about this. But we're thrilled that Inbal Arieli is opening our session. You've all received her bio, so I'm not going to read it out, but I will say that we've had the pleasure of working together. Inbal met our JCC Association Leadership Group, the 70 Faces of Israel group, earlier this year. And as is mentioned in her bio, she is one of the 100 most influential people in the Israeli high-tech world. And so she is supremely qualified talking about the whole concept of entrepreneurship in Israel. But we hear a lot about entrepreneurship in Israel. And I think that what will make Inbal's presentation very interesting and much more exciting for us this evening, or today, is become such a high-tech success. What are some of the factors that have led to this high-tech success? So, Inbal, I invite you to meet our JCC friends. We have people here from Houston and from Irvine and from New York and from Rhode Island, and a fabulous bunch of professionals and lay leaders. And thank you for joining us, Inbal.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and hi everyone. It's evening here in Tel Aviv, and I'm happy we managed to connect through technology and provide you with this content remotely. So what we'll do in the next hour, we'll leave time for questions at the end. But what I want to share with you is a fresh perspective to things you've already heard, but providing them to you in a different way and through a different lens. Oops, just a second. Okay. And actually, to start, you've all heard already, and I'm sure you know the statistics and the positioning of Israel as a global hub of innovation and entrepreneurship. But what I want to do today, and inspired by the French philosopher Marcel Proust, is to take you into a voyage, into a landscape that you already know, or you're familiar with, but actually provide a new set of glasses or a new lens for you to look at that landscape. And that will be our view on Israel. It will be, I hope, somehow different from what you've heard so far. But at the same time, as we do that, I also want us to keep thinking not just about Israel and what's happening here, but actually what's happening in the world, definitely in the US and in all of your communities. And for that, I want to refer to the World Economic Forum has published recently a very interesting report called The Future of the Jobs for the Future. And in that report, what they're doing is actually looking at the declining skills that humanity in the work job, in the employment market, will need less and less, versus the growing skills. Those skills that will be in more demand, those skills that people, our kids definitely, but also ourselves already, will need to foster. And I want you to take a second to review the list on the left side, which is actually the growing, those skills that are becoming in more and more demand. So just a quick overview, and I can later on send you the report for those interested. It's a fascinating reading. So combining these two worlds, a fresh perspective on Israel, and then remembering the skills that are in demand and growth in the world, mostly, as you can see from this list, soft skills. So whereas expertise and specific knowledge is actually in memory is declining, these soft skills to our left are actually growing. And we'll actually talk about them. I'm often asked, what is the main reason, or what are the main reasons for the flourishing Israeli tech ecosystem? And I won't ask you now because we are too many people in this conversation. Usually I ask that question and I get actually the same response all over again. And that is the military. Because we've been told for so many years that the main differentiator, the main reason that actually fosters and creates such a fertile environment for Israeli innovation to flourish in, for Israeli entrepreneurship, and the hotbed for all the successful Israeli entrepreneurs is the military. And the world is actually fascinated by this phenomena. So this is an article that was published on Forbes International magazine 2 years ago. And what they tried to do was to unpack the phenomenon, the secret behind 8200, which I hope you've heard about, but for those who haven't, it's the equivalent of the NSA. Only in Israel, it's a military unit, so it's part of the military. And many of Israel's most successful tech entrepreneurs used to serve in that unit during their military service. So government, policymakers, corporates around the world are actually looking and trying to understand what's so special in this unit and other units in the Israeli military, and believe that this is the main reason for the high positioning today of the Israeli entrepreneurial ecosystem. But here's where I want to offer a fresh perspective. Because as you know, we joined the military at the age of 18. And by the way, today, even more than before, not all Israelis join the military. We have large groups in the Israeli society that do not join the military for different reasons. But even for those who do join, we join at the age of 18. And as you can imagine, it's not a magical moment in time where it's our 18th birthday, we join 8200 and we become these entrepreneurial people. It's actually much more complicated than that. And in my view, it actually starts much, much, much earlier. So the only connection here between these two photos are the military boots of my dad. Every Israeli kid have these at home because their parents go and do reserve duty as they grow. But I strongly believe that the entrepreneurial mindset that exists in Israel and the soft skills that are nurtured here and that are so important for the future of the world in general, definitely for the Israeli economy, are actually fostered from a very, very young age, as young as 2 or 3. So in the next 20 minutes, 25 minutes, that's what we'll do. We'll go through a journey of a typical Israeli childhood, okay? And I'll take you step by step with daily images from our life here, but I'll offer a fresh view on them. And we'll try together to understand, how these stages in life and how these moments in the typical Israeli childhood actually are related to the development of the soft skills. And secondly, what from these moments, frameworks, practices, you can actually take, because nobody really suggests that big countries or corporates or business executives would, replicate the Israeli military. That's impossible and not a valid offer. But there are frameworks and principles that could definitely be replicated and adopted. So let's start. And our first moment is actually one which I'm sure you all recognize. So typical slide, you can see these everywhere in the world, right? At the age of 4, I'm born and raised in Israel, but as a child, my dad was a diplomat and we traveled a lot. And at the age of 4, we moved from Beersheba, in the south of Israel, exactly 40 years ago. So it was still a relatively small city in the desert. It wasn't the cyber capital of Israel back then. And we moved from Beersheba to Geneva. Okay, you can imagine Switzerland. You can imagine the contrast, the difference for a young child. First week at school in the International School of Geneva, I didn't speak English. I didn't speak French. I only understood Hebrew, but my kindergarten teacher did not speak Hebrew, and she showed me around, and she really helped me to orient myself in the first few days. And one of my strongest memories from then is the playground and the kids who were really welcoming, and the teacher taking me by the hand and showing me, taking me to the slide and really guiding me through the process. So showing me, there was a kid in front of me, and he was going up the ladder, and she said like this, you stop. So I waited, and once the kid was up on the slide, that was my cue. I could go up the ladder. The kid joyfully went down the slide, and that was my cue. And it was very pleasant. It was a structure I knew. I felt at home. Great. A friend sent me this picture from a playground in one of the Eastern countries in Europe. And I want you to take a look at that for a second, because what you can see here is actually what the kids are not supposed to do in the playground. For example, pets are not allowed, dogs are not allowed. Probably makes sense. And it's not allowed to bring glass bottles. You might say it also makes sense because it's dangerous. Kids are not supposed to drive their bicycles. They're not supposed to eat ice cream. Okay. And then there is this beautiful middle image, which you can see. They're also not allowed to slide backwards or to climb the slide. I don't know exactly what they were trying to describe here. But there are a lot of guidelines on what kids are not supposed to do in this playground. Now, somehow similar or complementary to my experience at preschool, at kindergarten in Switzerland, where the teacher actually showed me and guided me, instructed me on what is the right way, what is the right process. This is what's happening here. Kids are told from a very young age what they're not supposed to do or how they're supposed to play. Now imagine Israel, playground, same slide, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, kids are coming out of their after school activities, chaos, right? It's nothing like Switzerland. It's nothing like that sign from the Eastern country in Europe. It's a completely different climax where kids actually run all over the place. They jump, they climb the slide, of course, they jump from the slide, they get stuck on the slide on purpose. Everything happening simultaneously. There's a lot of noise, there's screaming. I mean, I assume you've all been to Israel, or most of you have been to Israel. I think you can imagine what I'm talking about, right? So both experiences for a child are actually fun, because eventually, you know, for a kid playing in a playground with the slide is a fun activity, no matter how it's held. But what's happening in Israel is that from a very, very young age, the environment, okay, is actually enabling much more freedom. And that freedom results in kids using much more their creativity. Not that they are more creative than kids in other places in the world. They're just being encouraged or just enabled to use that creativity much more. And for me, this example of the slide is, if you want, really the essence of so many things that are rooted in the way we foster from a very, very young age those soft skills that are then eventually so critical for entrepreneurship and for innovation thinking. And let's continue. During that first stage of early childhood, I think of it as at a discovery stage. So if I had to think in parallel between growing in Israel or the childhood journey in Israel and the life cycle of a business, as someone who's coming from the business space and is very much involved in business activity here in Israel, I think of it as the discovery stage, the exploration stage, where the idea is not to actually follow an existent reality, but actually to explore around it. And balagan, for those of you who know the Israeli word, which means mess and chaos, is actually not a word originating from Hebrew. It's a word that originally from Persian, then to Russian, and made some alterations before we adopted it here in Israel. It used to mean the backstage of a theater or the attic, where we actually, put a lot of stuff in a mess and we don't look at that. But in Israel, balagan is everywhere. Everything is chaotic, everything is messy. It has its disadvantages, it has its price, but it also has a lot of value. Because out of that balagan, actually, one can create a new order, and one can innovate, and one can disrupt. And I think that is a beautiful way to look at the chaotic environment that exists here in Israel and how it actually influences then those skills. Now let's continue into another example. So I don't know how many of you know this song. It's an Israeli song called Ani baniti bayit. That's how we call it. So I built a house. And this song is still taught in schools at the age of 6 or 7 towards Independence Day. And it tells the story of how the country of Israel, the state of Israel, was built. Every Israeli you will meet, they know that song by heart, because they were taught that song year over year at school. Their kids know it. It's really a childhood song that we all know. But when looking carefully at the song and the meaning of the words and the words themselves, I found something very interesting here. So the song asks question, who built a house? And then the kids answer, I built a house in the land of Israel. Who paved a road? I paved a road. I planted a tree. I built a bridge. I did a lot of things. Now, mind you, I did not build my house or my garden. I built a house. So that's one very interesting element. But me being capable of doing that means a lot about how strong I am as a person, how capable I am as a person, how resourceful I am as a person, how reliant I am as a person. I can do a lot of things, and big things, and not only big things, but things that are not necessarily for my own benefit, but are actually for a greater goal. And that by itself, I think, is very interesting. But then actually, the song asks, who built and who planted? And we repeat over and over again, all of us together. So next to this very strong individual who's capable of doing a lot of things, and I remind you, this is a song that 6, 7, 8-year-olds kids sing. So, and they talk about themselves. I did it, I did it, I did it. So we teach them, in a sense, to think of themselves as very strong, capable individuals, thinking of a greater goal than just themselves, but at the same time, doing everything together. That balance between a very strong individual, which is still capable of working in a collective as a team at the same time, okay? That's a very important principle that we see over and over in different stages in Israeli childhood, in different aspects of Israeli childhood. Fast forward, businesses, entrepreneurship, that connection between, or optimization, if you want, between my own goals as an individual and my capabilities as an individual and my self-esteem as an individual, along and at the same time being part of a group, it's a force multiplier. Now, as we continue our journey, this is definitely one of my kids' favorite moments in the Jewish calendar. And I don't know how many of you recognize, I mean, it's a bonfire, but it's not just a bonfire. Lag BaOmer is a Jewish holiday, which I hope you know. I'm not sure you're that familiar with. And it's a one evening holiday where the custom is to light bonfires. Now, these bonfires are lit all over the country. This picture was taken in Ramat Aviv, next to the university where we live. And not only that it's in Tel Aviv, next to the university. What you don't see here are another at least 30 bonfires, larger than this small one, side by side. And the other thing that you don't see here is the gas station that is just in front of the kids in a very, very, very short distance. It's the main gas station on the Haifa road, on the seashore road. And this has been the only strip, this is the only strip still available in our neighborhood to light bonfires at Lag BaOmer. And for the past 30 years, this is where our entire neighborhood, all the preschools, all the schools gather at that evening, and the kids light the bonfire. Now, if you look at the bonfire, you'll see that the barriers, okay, the borders of the bonfire are not very formal. It's stones that the kids themselves have placed there. They're literally playing with fire. They're not doing it hidden from their parents. I hope you can see in the back of the picture, there's a parent on the right side, and there are a few parents talking there. The parents are there overseeing the whole thing, but at the same time providing a lot of freedom to these kids. Now, this exercise by itself of lighting the bonfires and having this entire evening that goes into night, where the kids as young as 9 or 10, 11 in this picture, where they manage the whole situation, is a team effort, is a project that they invest a lot of thought in, through which they learn to manage risks. And again, train a lot of muscles that are then very relevant to our future startup nation world. But what I want you to see is actually not only this part of the event, because that's a one evening. What's happening before that event is in a sense even more interesting, to my opinion. Because where would a Tel Avivian boy find, or group of boys, where would they find these tranches of wood? We don't have in Israel at Ace or the supermarkets these blocks of wood tranches that you buy in the US for heating, because almost nobody heats here their home with woods. So you can't really buy them. You need to find them elsewhere. And where would you find the supply in Tel Aviv? So the simple answer is in construction sites. And this is a picture also taken in Tel Aviv, where you can see a group of 9, 10-year-old kids exiting actually a construction site on their left with 2 big signs, no entry signs, very clear, okay? So they're actually stepping out of that construction site where they visited daylight, a relatively, I would say, big street next to the Ramat Aviv University, with their supply that they just found. Now they need to carry it because they can't just carry one by one. So they also borrowed, if you want, a supermarket cart from the supermarket, which they're now using for 2 weeks. And they're not the only group doing that. You see dozens of groups in the street doing the same thing for 2 weeks, wandering the streets of all the cities in Tel Aviv, in Israel, everywhere in the country, using the supermarket carts for a completely different intent than originally planned. You might even say they're not supposed to do that, of course. It's that this is private equipment, right? Private assets. Daylight, coming out of a construction site, dangerous, and yet it's okay. And what the kids learn from these projects, and it's not defined, by the way, as a project. It's not like someone told them, okay, you have now a 2 weeks project to do that. It's kind of a best practice. They just prepare for Lag BaOmer around May and just do it themselves. They learn so much about managing a project, about making decisions, about collaborating, about managing risks, about competing with other groups. And they learn these and they train actually over and over these skills, not by being taught and spoken to them, but actually through experience. And for children, learning through experience, not only for children, for everyone, that is the best way of learning. Now, I mentioned the supermarket cart, and that actually brings me to my next example. So I'm not sure you would guess where this is, but for any Israeli who went to the education system in Israel, we know this place because all schools in Israel go through this experience. This was taken at the Nachal HaKibbutzim. It's the Kibbutzim River up north, goes through next to Bet She'an, the Sachne. It's a relatively low river, so it's not very dangerous. But what's fun about it is that many years ago, they placed these pipes between different sizes of or different parts of the river below concrete bridges. So you can see the pipe on your right. You can see how old it is. You can see how rusty it is. And the kids actually are encouraged to go through the pipe from one side. It's like a slide. It's like a water park, but a natural one, in super old, rusty, unsafe pipes. Now, what's interesting here is the sign above. So if we had well, Sarah, I know you read Hebrew, but and most of you, maybe some of you also read Hebrew, but I'll say it says danger. Entering and transpassing the pipe is forbidden and dangerous. Clear, simple. Okay. And then on the right side, you have the logo of the Parks Authority in Israel. Now, what's happening at the same time, as you can see, is there's this line of kids waiting to pass through the pipe and actually pursue this forbidden and unsecure activity. But they're not doing it alone. They're actually doing it with the support of their teacher. This woman with the black t-shirt in the back is the teacher, with some of the parents who are accompanying this field trip, and nonetheless with the instructor of the Parks Authority, the guy with the blue t-shirt in the front holding the sign. So he's actually representing the authority with a sign above us saying no entrance, it's forbidden, and at the same time encouraging the kids to go one by one through the pipe. This is not a very pleasant, could be translated in not a very pleasant, picture and image that stands behind it. Because in a sense, what the kids are learning here is that every rule is meant to be broken, or some rules are meant to be broken, right? Which, again, if you'll drive the streets of Tel Aviv these days, you'll see all the scooters going in the wrong direction. You'll see pedestrians just walking on the street. A real chaotic situation, which also has severe price in lives and injuries. But in the context of innovation and in the context of entrepreneurship, training the ability to not always follow the rules, but actually use some discretion on which rules I'm supposed to always follow and which rules could be broken in a certain way. Again, I know, and I'm open to that criticism, and I have my criticism myself on that it also has a price from a society, of course, perspective, from a culture perspective. But in the context of innovation, this is gold. Because innovation is all about breaking existing rules. It's all about disrupting. It's all about thinking of something new that did not exist a second before. And if I'm always using the slide in the same way, up the ladder, down the slide, because that's how I was taught to do, and that's what I know I'm expected to do, then the chances to later on in life develop and really practice these creative muscles becomes smaller and smaller, and it becomes a more challenging situation. It's definitely possible, and that's what I'm arguing in the book, but it's more challenging. So this funny character, his name is Yatsek. And Yatsek was a character in a TV show that ran for over a decade here in Israel, called Zehu Zeh. It was when we used to have only one channel, the first channel, and once a week there was a TV show, a comedy TV show that everyone, all the young kids in Israel and teenagers used to watch, and that was it. And Yatsek had 3 minutes in that show, or 5 minutes in that show, where he used to tour Israel. And every week he was in a different place, and the audience at home had to guess where he was. Again, it was 20 plus years ago, so no social media and no immediate answer, but people used to really call the show, and the first person who called and had the right answer would win a t-shirt. It was a huge thing in Israel. So he was kind of if you want a history or geography guide in this TV show, with this chalutz, with this costume that everyone knows, with the hat. But here's the interesting thing about Yatsek. Every episode of Yatsek ended with the same ending. Something bad always happened to him. He fell from a tree, he fell into the river, he got stuck in cow's mud. Every time, every week, something bad used to happen to him. But he would immediately stand up, and all the kids in the show would run after him and say, Yatsek, Yatsek, what happened to you? But he would immediately stand up and say, hey, kids, no need to worry. Yatsek always falls and gets back. Now, again, every Israeli you'll talk to, and you'll tell him, Yatsek tamid nofel, Yatsek always falls, they will immediately say, and gets back on his feet. And that message, along with the general anti-failure, I would say, or failure tolerance that exists in Israeli society, is rooted very deeply in the approach that Israeli kids at different ages, and then later on Israeli adults have when they're trying actually to succeed. And you're much more credited here in Israel, or valued based on your actual doing and trying, than discredited because of your failures. This, in my opinion, is also a critical element that culturally exists here, that in different ways can be adopted in specific frameworks, with using several principles, be it in education systems, in business organizations. We can find the way of finding pockets where trial and testing and exploration is more important than not failing. And by that, actually encouraging the members of that specific group to try. And that brings us to the, if you want, a summary of the second stage of that. If the first stage was the toddler age, the very early age, the age of childhood is more of a validation, where you actually validate what you think you know about the world, what at that age, even at a young age, and how you think the world operates, and you criticize it, and you test limits, and you become more resilient, and you keep experimenting all the time. And the next step the stage I want to talk about is being an Israeli teenager. And what does that mean? So this is a picture of Israeli 14, 15-year-old kids, teenagers. They're instructor in the Tzofim. I know many of the Tzofim are also part and around of the activities are in the JCCs. The Tzofim is not an Israeli movement. It was not invented here in Israel. It was imported to Israel, but adapted to the Israeli mentality. And the Tzofim organization in Israel does have few different or changed elements than the ones originally conceived. And maybe to give you a hint to that, we'll talk about this word. So in English, teenagers or adolescents, in most languages, the meaning is the same. It's either your teen years, the decade of your second decade in life, the decade of the teen years, or becoming an adult. In Hebrew, however, the most common term, expression used to describe teenagers is this, tipesh esre. So the decade of stupidity. And that's how we call them. We tell them, you're a tipesh esre, you're not a teenager, you're in your stupidity age. Now, Israeli teenagers and American teenagers and French teenagers and Asian teenagers and teenagers all over the world are going through the same biological changes. They're not supposed to be very different from one another. Again, like in the slide, like in the playground example, what is different from one society to the other is the way the society reacts to them. So by telling them, you're going through a stupidity phase, you're testing, you're exploring, you're checking our patience and our boundaries. I have two teenagers at home. I have a 17-year-old kid and a 14-year-old teenager at home. They are testing me all the time. But that's what they're supposed to do, by the way. That's fine. So by telling them that, we actually tell them, you know what? For a certain period of time, for a stage in your childhood, this is what you're supposed to do. This is what society expects from you. But does that mean we only expect from them to act stupidly? Not at all. Actually, the opposite. While experimenting, while testing, while exploring the world around them, we can also give them at the same time a lot of responsibility. And going back to these Tzofim guides, the instructors, so the entire Tzofim organization in Israel, as you know, where you have Tzofim around the US, the instructors are teenagers, building the curriculum, the values, the budget, responsible for in Israel, when there's a Tzofim trip for 2 or 3 nights, it's only teenagers with younger kids. There are no adults there. It's a whole tribe of 1,000 people, is led by maximum a 20-year-old person. That's it, or 20, 21 after the military, but essentially and mostly by these 14, 15, 16-year-old instructors. So while telling them it's totally fine to explore and to try and to check, that's what you're supposed to do, at the same time, you are capable of doing very meaningful things for yourself and achieving and even mentoring younger kids and becoming their role model. And when you take the tachlis approach to life in Israel, which means very, bottom line, no going around, just doing what's necessary to do to achieve something, and combine that with the notion of yeh beseder, everything will be okay, right? I'm sure you've heard that from many Israelis. Whatever the situation is, no matter how hard, difficult things are, eventually everything will be okay. Yeh beseder, we'll figure it out, right? Which by itself is an essential and must-have approach to life of an entrepreneur. Because entrepreneurs, statistically, all over the world, 90% of startups, for example, in Israel and in the US, in Silicon Valley, fail. That's the statistics. So if you're not optimistic, the chances are against you. It doesn't make sense to start something, to innovate, to try. That notion of tachlis, the actual doing, the bottom line doing, together with the yeh beseder, teenagers, tipesh esre, stupid age, here's the result. Now, what is this? This is a construction built in the framework of the Tzofim in Israel, in Purim, in the Israeli, the Jewish Halloween, Purim. The Tzufim have these events all over Israel. I don't know if you have them also in the Tzufim in the US, but what they do is they actually build overnight these constructions. And when I say overnight, it's 14, 15-year-old kids that are building these constructions after they've designed them 3 months before. They were approved. And then overnight, and why overnight? Because typically these events would take place in the school backyard, in schools' backyards. And that's the only day. They have only one evening to prepare for that, because before that, the school was busy with being a school. So they get the night and the day before, they build these crazy, crazy constructions. They do all the time. They do everything by themselves, no supervision at all. Following day, the entire neighborhood, the whole community, the whole Tzufim tribe comes with their costumes, you can see, and they're actually using, for real, these overnight built constructions by 14, 15-year-old kids. Not safe at all, I'm telling you. And we've had, along the years, we've had injuries, different types of injuries in different places and tribes of Tzufim across Israel. And yet, over and over again, this tradition repeats. And yes, I hinted, of course, there's always a price, but there's also a lot of value in it, in letting these kids manage these huge projects by themselves and letting them take ownership and accountability with some very basic, minimal ground rules around them. Another great example for what it means to be an Israeli teenager, that tipesh esrei, but at the same time get a lot of responsibility, is the example of the Red Cross. So the Red Cross organization in Israel and elsewhere in the world is typically based on a large amount of a proportion of volunteers. That's not different in Israel. Typically more than 50% of the people active in the Red Cross in Magen David Adom would be volunteers. But here's the interesting fact. 64% of the volunteers in Magen David Adom in Israel are between the ages of 15 and 18. So most of the volunteers in Magen David Adom are at that tipesh esrei phase. Not only that, they don't do paperwork, they don't answer the calls. What they do is they go in those ambulances. That is what the Israeli volunteers, the teenager volunteers of Magen David Adom do in Israel. They actually go outside together. Typically, it would be with a more experienced, it will always be with a driver, the more experienced paramedic, and 2 or 3 teenagers would join them and would be taking care of people's lives and car accidents and injuries at real time by themselves after they've been trained in a 6 months or 7 months course, which is of course very prestigious. But here again, you can sense the tension or the balance between, on one hand, providing a very open framework for exploration, for without limits, but at the same time, and it's possible, at the same time, also providing a lot of responsibility and accountability, which results in these teenagers doing amazing things, amazing things. And for me, that is the equivalent, if you want, of the third stage in the life cycle of a business, where it's all about efficiency and finding your own, as a business or as a teenager, getting to know yourself really well and finding your way in the world in an optimal way for yourself, not necessarily from someone else, but for yourself. And doing that while in Israel, you have to constantly cope with uncertainty. Because the only certain thing that we have here is uncertainty. I had my cousins, my family from France here, they slept over the past 2 nights, and watching the news at 8 o'clock, we had, once again, you might have heard in Ashdod or in Ashkelon, while Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was there were rockets. So I told them, you know, at night, just in case, if you hear a siren, so you know what you do. And they were, whoa, 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 what siren now? And I said, no, nothing is supposed to happen, but just in case. Now, for us, for our kids in Tel Aviv, we're just trained, we're alert to any uncertain activity because that's our routine. Our routine is from one uncertainty to the other, from one uncertainty to the other. Now, if you think of the future of jobs, of the future of the world, of the future of economies, the only thing we know is that we don't really know how that future would look like. We can make a lot of assumptions, but we don't really know. And being capable of coping with uncertainty, of feeling comfortable, at ease, with making plans, but understanding that they most probably will need to be altered and changed completely from what we had in mind, that is, again, a substantial, I would say, a must-have muscle, thinking about the future. And now, only now, after I've equipped you with the toolbox, with some examples, of course there are so many more, of the toolbox that Israelis are actually bringing with them. They're already equipped with that toolbox or muscles, however you want to call them. Now they're joining the military. But they've already been in class where they had to speak out loud because otherwise nobody would notice them because there are 40 kids in class. And they're already been at the Tzofim, where someone who's only 2 years older than them felt like, you know, for them, like the greatest role model. And they've learned to challenge that authority in families and manage conflicts and conversations and arguments with their parents, with their teachers, with their friends. They've already learned all of that, and now they're joining the military. And then that environment, the Israeli military, definitely enables the continuity of these skills. But it's not that they're developed there. They're actually being cultivated and fostered and deepened in the Israeli military forces. And I'll touch really on extremely briefly because I'm watching the time here. I want to talk about two elements that I think are the most interesting in my opinion. The first is the first thing here. The fact that the Israeli military recruits young people at the age of 18, but screens them at the age of 17, requires by definition a completely different screening methodology than we have in other places, such as academic institutions in the US or in Israel. Because at the age of 17, you don't have any relevant past experience, knowledge, background to being a military professional in 8200 or a combat soldier in Sayeret Matkal in special forces or a pilot. You don't. And that's totally normal. So the Israeli military had no other choice but to design unique screening methodologies for unique positions, different methodologies for different positions, which are actually based not on their past accomplishments and their grades at school, but actually on their potential and what they can do. And with a challenge of scale that we have in Israel, it's not like you can say, okay, I'll take the kids from the best schools in Israel, which, by the way, you know, we have a public education system. So the gaps exist, but they're not that high. I'll take the best schools and I'll focus on these schools for more prestige or demanding positions. No, there's not enough. 8200, as an example, cannot rely only on these people. It needs to actually broaden its pipeline. And broadening the pipeline means that I need to look at the potential coming into the pipeline from a different perspective. Now, thinking again about the future and Generation Y and definitely Generation Z, they're coming with different credentials than I used to come with. And they're looking at their self-esteem and what they're bringing, their value, in a completely different way. It's much more about what they're capable of doing potentially, if they get the right environment, if they get the right tools, rather than what they did in the past. And I think that is a critical, really, a very important element that is already translated into the corporate world. We see more and more big companies completely changing the way they recruit people and changing the requirements, the specifications. Some even completely disregarding now academic credentials. The second important thing that I would like to point out here is what's in blue, and that is the notion of getting stuck. One of the things that the Israeli military trains by intent, its forces in general, but special forces in specific, is to cope with not knowing. Now that's a little counterintuitive to how we were brought up, everyone, because we are used to be credited for what we know. But the Israeli military needs people who feel comfortable not having all the answers and asking questions and doubting within the military, not just commanders, regular, simple soldiers. We want them to think. We don't want them just to follow orders. We don't want them just to follow best practices or guidance they got. Because when they're facing a real event and they need to make the decision, we want them to be capable of thinking for themselves and using their accumulated now experience, but also rationale, instinct, everything they have to make the optimal decision for that moment. They don't have time to go back and ask questions now. And that is definitely a muscle. Coping with not knowing and feeling comfortable with not knowing can bring to great development, actually, and growth, personal growth. Because once you admit to yourself, not to others, to admit to yourself that you don't know, that's when you start learning. I'll continue quick. This is an image really that for me captures in one image the essence of what it means to be part of the Israeli military, of some aspects of it. I hope you can see the soldier on the left. He's not asleep, he's awake, he's talking to his friend. The one with the gray signs here are the officers. There are a few in the room, and all the others are regular soldiers. They're all sitting together. They're all listening to the commander, who's even with his back to some of his soldiers because he has others in front. But what this picture shows, I think, more than anything, is that the formality, the formal hierarchy, the formal organization of things is of lower importance here. And what's of higher importance is the dynamics, is creating a conversation, is having people really engaged, not just sitting in front of you and organized, but really engaged in what he's talking about and what he's debriefing them. Even if they're holding a conversation in the back, that's fine. That's fine, because the assumption is that once they're either talking about that, or even if not, that they understand when is of essence the right time to be really focused. And if in most military organizations around the world, it's about following orders, which is a military jargon. In Israel, you don't really have that. It's more about challenging in the military, but then collaborating. Back to the Lag BaOmer event and other events. So collaboration and teamwork is critical. And in special forces, we recruit extremely talented individuals, but we always look from the very beginning on their capability as one of the core elements that we're screening them is their capability to work in a team. Because an individualistic talent is not optimal for the Israeli military. We need an individualistic talent that can also work as part of a team. And bringing it back in a sense, comparing it to the US, and as you've seen, I like using expressions from our culture because I think they say a lot more than just the words. So Rosh Gadol means in Hebrew, big head. That's the translation. But it doesn't have the meaning it has in English. In English, it has a negative meaning. It means an arrogant person, someone full of themselves. Not in Hebrew. In Hebrew, it's actually a term, an expression that originated in the military and means someone that is actually doing much more than they're expected to do, beyond their role, capable of making decisions, of taking risks, of leading others. Being Rosh Gadol, being big head, thinking big, is actually the role model in the military. These are the soldiers that are then promoted and cherry-picked for officer schools, the one that are thinking beyond what they're told initially. I have a few more examples as we grow and even leave the military to exploring the boundaries outside of Israel and creating very strong networks that are then also very important and can be parallel to the life cycle of a business. But I want to go back to this slide for a second and invite you to take now another look at the growing skills, the skills in demand as the World Economic Forum defines them, regardless of Israel. And I think that now, after this 45 minutes or 40 minutes of presentation, you can now see what I'm talking about and how these critical soft skills that are fostered here from a very, very young age are becoming so meaningful, so valuable, and really critical for the future of any person. Now, do you need to live in Israel to have them? No, of course not. Can you learn from the Israeli experience, principles, applications, frameworks, in how to design an environment to nurture them? I think yes. And this is what I tried to do in Chutzpah, in the book that was just released. I'll come back to the book in a second, but I want to finish with this. So I told you a little bit about myself. This is my family, my extended family. We're 4 generations here, typical Israeli family. Okay, my family, I love my family, I'm very proud of it, but it's not that different from other Israeli families. And it's not that different from any other families around the world. Now, assuming, and that is my assumption, that this is a caring, loving family, as my family is, and that this family was trying to do the exact same thing as my family was trying to do, to capture a moment of happiness of the family, the strongest, closest group together, and for the memory, right? You will hardly ever see this type of picture in an Israeli home. You'll see much more of these because this by itself, again, as loving, both families are loving and are caring and are as strong and valuable to each other. But this chaotic picture is a great manifestation of the individualistic approach with the collective one. The strong place we give, the free environment we give to each person to be themselves from a very, very young age. And that is why I call the presentation Roots of Entrepreneurship, because it really starts from a very young age, from this close group of the family. And with that, I'm very happy to take your questions.
So thank you so much, Inbal. As you can see, everybody, Inbal's book, and she's going to be going on a speaking tour that will coincide with many of the book fairs at JCCs. So her book is available, as you can see, on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, etc. We have filled up our hour, but if anyone has a burning question that they would like to ask, perhaps just go for it. And if too many people talk at the same time, then we'll have to manage it through the chats. So does anyone have a question they would like to ask Inbal? We'll limit it to 2 or 3 questions. They're all stunned. You
Yes,
can unmute yourself if
I'm
you want
trying.
to
Yeah.
ask a question.
I never had that before.
Well, I want to just say something. I think the medium of Zoom is the most phenomenal thing, that we're speaking to people all over the country. It's also a very hard thing to present to, because you can't
Yeah.
always see the people you're presenting to. But I think we have a question here. Go for it.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Inbal. It was a fantastic presentation. We're already making plans to bring you to Northern Virginia.
Mhm.
I hope you'll enjoy coming here. One question I had, it was fascinating when you were talking about the ramp up to the military, and I was wondering about the cultural challenges of the lone soldier coming from the United States without that ramp up that you beautifully described, and being sort of thrust into that environment. Can you talk just very briefly about that?
Yes, I thank you for this question. And I'm actually planning on doing a little bit of research, interviewing lonely soldiers, or even not lonely soldiers, but people who came to Israel, you know, just before the military, and how their experience was. And unfortunately, I'll say, I don't know if you've heard, if you've followed the news in Israel, but there was a news article, a magazine, unfortunately, about few very sad cases of soldiers, of lonely soldiers who could not cope with all that, in their eyes, stress, but that uncertainty and that chaos and that messiness that exists here. So I agree. I think it's a challenge. I think that really demonstrates that it's not a magical moment that happens in the military. It's not like you're joining the military and now you're being taught these elements. And I think that from a few conversations I've had with lonely soldiers, or again, people who came to Israel just before the military, even with their families, one of their challenges is to understand, to translate better these principles and these cultural elements in day to day. Okay, it could be in the street, in the road while driving, and it definitely is sensed even more in the military. Because if I'll have to speak in generalities, okay, and excuse me for doing that, but I want you to follow on this example. I would assume, again, on average, in generalities, that the lonely soldier coming from the US, who was brought up in the regular American system, we'll take a typical one, is used to a certain order in mind and has a certain image of what they're expecting. Now, they join the military in day one, they're given equipment, and at the same time, they're being told, which is military equipment, standard equipment. One might assume that you're not supposed to alter this equipment, right? Because that's military equipment. Oh no, in Israel, the coolest soldier at boot camp, 2 days into boot camp, is the one that completely modified and changed his equipment, improved it. And these things happen very quickly. And so I agree it's a challenge. I think it's, for your communities, it's an important one to address. Of course, I can't tell you how moved I am when I meet lonely soldiers that are coming here to Israel. And I think that many of them eventually grow into a positive experience, but maybe a better preparation of these aspects, these cultural aspects, very specific ones, could help them.
So can I ask a follow-up question? So I think it's interesting to think about the evolution of a lone soldier into this environment, but I think better understanding that dichotomy can also help us in the States to find ways to engage the Israeli populations that are living in the States, because we often find sort of the reverse cultural challenges here. And you know, we're seeing it in the Sheva program, in the early education program, which is based on a play-based experimental kind of an approach. But I think once they get out of the preschool and they're into the mainstream schools, we lose that to a great deal. So how we can extend what we're doing in preschool further, and how we can better understand how to translate between an American or diaspora mentality to an Israeli mentality is going to help us not only understand Israel better and aspire to what Israel does great, but also to figure out how to engage Israelis in the United States.
I couldn't agree more. I really couldn't agree more. I'd like to give you a quick example, and I don't mind staying for another few minutes if you're interested. I have the time. My company, we're a business that operates in the US, but we have an arm here in Israel. So we are 4 partners, 2 Israelis and 2 Americans. And the Americans, they're not Jewish, they're not related to Israel. Before they met us, they had nothing to do with Israel. After one of our first, sessions as a team, the 4 of us, one of the Americans approached me and said, "Inbal, listen, why are you and Shirley," that's my co-CEO, who's by the way Israeli but lives in the States for the past 20 years, and her kids are totally American, "why are you arguing all the time? It seems like you don't agree on anything." And I said, "You know what? That's funny, because we are in agreement on a lot of things, and we actually reached that great decision at the end of the session. At the beginning, I was surprised. But then I told you, you know what? I think I understand the problem here. You translated, so my American partner translated our very vivid, very active argument as an argument, as a conflict. While for us, it's just a way of brainstorming. This is how we think. We challenge each other. And that was for me a great example on, the difference of perception and how things are seen from the outside. And just to end with this example with a funny anecdote, I then told him, we were brainstorming, right? That was the purpose of the meeting. He said, yes. So I told him, have you ever seen a pleasant, quiet storm? Aren't storms supposed to be, very active and shaking? And I think for him, that was a great explanation, because since he doesn't think we're arguing, he understands that we're just challenging and kind of, optimizing our discussion through these counter arguments.
Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a question? I know that we've had to lose some people who've had to go off to other meetings, but if anyone has one more question, then Inbal has kindly agreed to stay around to answer.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. So I work with a lot of Israelis during the summer as counselors at our camp. They're in the range of about they come after the army. And one of the interesting things that, obviously a strength they bring to camp is this whole mentality about kind of pushing authority and asking questions and trying to make us better. And sometimes I find that it really ends up being a barrier for them to buy in to what we're really trying to do, and them appreciating that we've done this for many, many years, and there's reasons why we do certain things we've learned over time. And I'm just curious for some feedback of ways to maybe handle that, because on the one hand, we really want to celebrate that they are questioning and trying to help us improve ourselves, and yet also it sometimes really hurts us being able to be on the same page as a community.
Yes, I can totally see that, how a 21-year-old kid former soldier or just Israeli would come and think they have the solutions for everything and they know better, and because that's how they were taught, trained to think and to always propose. I think if I were you, one of the things I would do would be to create routines or pockets of routines within the program where they can actually do that. So you would on one hand enable them that, because by the way, I want to hope that sometimes they come with good ideas and improvements. So providing them with these pockets would actually free them from doing that all the time. Now, it doesn't mean that they won't at the beginning do it more than afterwards, but they'll learn, they'll know rapidly that, I don't know, let's say, I'm just inventing now, okay, here, every day at 5 o'clock, the whole team of instructors get together for a half an hour of new ideas. So they'll keep their new ideas to 5 o'clock, in a sense, okay? I see what you're saying, and it's exactly what the presentation is about. It's exactly about not always assuming that what we've done for so many years is optimal just because we've done it for so many years. And
yeah, and I will say, you know, I appreciate, I mean, I think it's so important to evaluate ourselves and question and always push ourselves to be our best. But I also really like when you said, when you admit to yourself that you don't know everything is when you start learning.
Yes.
So it's always like everything, right? It's about striking a balance.
Right.
And thank you very much. No, I like the idea of kind of creating a more formal setting where, you know, this is where you're going to have an arena to voice your opinions, some of which will be really, you know, maybe taken into consideration and acted upon, and others where sometimes we have to just accept that something is the way it is for whatever reason. But I know, thank you. Thank you.
And then just another thing on top of that is that I think talking about Israelis coming to the US in business or in for universities and in those very important missions, one of the things that they do not realize is the scale. Because, you know, for us, everything is really small scale. And in small scale, it's easier to be much more creative and much more agile. In larger scale, like some of your operations, and this is something that Israeli entrepreneurs, for example, in startups, they learn relatively fast when they start working with the US, that a client of a small, medium business in the US of 1,000, 3,000, 5,000 people, in Israel, it's a huge business. And that there needs to be a certain calibration when they think of that scale. So one other thing you could do is at the beginning and over again, remind them of that scale and what it means to hold a camp for, I don't know the numbers, but let's say 3,000 kids. It's a different story than their tribe at the Tzofim or their unit in the military of 300 people.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for staying on the extra time. I appreciate that.
So, Inbal, thank you so much for your time this evening. I think it's been a great insight, and what's so interesting is that the questions have come from, wow, now we can understand the Israelis who come to our community a little better, which is a different twist maybe from the purpose of your research and your analysis of childhood and adolescence in Israel. I want to thank everybody for joining us and hope that you have found this of interest. We always promise that, you know, what are the take-home value for this? So the take-home value is perhaps that what people have found for themselves, perhaps understanding your Israeli families a little better and the independence that they give their children. But I think this whole area of Startup Nation is a very exciting area, and because it goes from everything from medicines to agriculture to fashion to food, it's a great way of plugging different people from your community into these areas. And there are a lot of resources online, whether it's Israel 21C website or No Camels, and there's a whole list of things that are on our website as well as, of course, Inbal's book herself, that can help people plug in and things that you can show at the JCC in the lobby or in specific sessions. So thank you to Inbal. A quick plug that on the 30th of October, we have Judy Tal Koppelman, who is a public Jewish artist here in Israel. She's going to be talking about public art here in Israel and also potentially in your JCC. So thank you.
Shana Tova to everyone.
Shana Tova, right? We're in the month of Elul. just a couple of weeks away from Rosh Hashanah, so Shana Tova, Happy New Year to everybody. Good night. Good day.
Bye-bye.